Greetings everyone, this is P and welcome to a video I've been wanting to make for quite a long time. This is a critique of Call of Duty World War II's campaign and branding. My goal is to break down everything both good and bad and explain why this game ultimately falls into mediocrity and wasted potentials. We will analyze the game level by level, covering its design, pacing, characters, story, narrative and gameplay. Expect some nitpicking, but it serves to highlight the broader issues of the game's execution. Spoiler warning in case you haven't played the game's campaign yet. We will go through the whole campaign, so be warned. Sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Having grown up with some of the most iconic World War II games of the early 2000s, I have a deep appreciation for the setting. When done right, it can be an immersive and powerful experience. Naturally, I was excited when Call of Duty decided to return to its World War II roots after years of futuristic entries. Call of Duty started as a straightforward World War II shooter, competing with Medal of Honor before evolving into a Modern Warfare-focused franchise. The Modern Warfare trilogy and the early Black Ops games are widely considered the franchise's golden era, which is a sentiment that I personally share. Around 2013, the series experimented with futuristic setting and mechanics. This trend kept going for several years, which apparently frustrated a lot of people. I myself despised the futuristic themes and designs at the time and craved for a World War II setting, or at least a good modern one. Of course, I grew out of these sentiments and I can now appreciate these experimental mechanics, which indeed had a lot of good things to offer. They were just released at the wrong time. Regardless of their quality and the developers' attempts to deliver the best possible experience, people were very clearly unhappy. That led the studios in need of a serious course correction, which is what gave us the game called Call of Duty World War II. Released in 2017 by Sledgehammer Games, Call of Duty World War II had one of the most uninspired titles in the franchise. Most people would probably glance over the overtly vagueness of the title, but people familiar with the franchise would instantly notice the problem with this. Which of course gets worse if you actually play through the game. I remember that when the game was announced, someone I knew who also played Call of Duty since its dawn asked me if this was a joke or not, because he couldn't believe that the game was actually and plainly called World War II. A game simply called World War II suggests a broad, multi-front depiction of the war. Instead, the game campaign focuses solely on the American effort in Western Europe across 11 levels. It's understandable that, it being a USA product, they would want to once again cover their own side of history, which is actually totally fine with me, as the Normandy landing is something I always welcome in games and movies. However, this misleading title reflects the game's rushed and uninspired approach. If the intent was to cover only this specific front, a title like Call of Duty Brotherhood would have been far more fitting. This generic title feels like a marketing tactic to instantly attract consumers who were fond of the more historical-based games and tired of the sci-fi trend, thus undermining their intelligence. Titles should be meaningful, reflecting the game's themes, setting and story, and this one fails to deliver. We are just getting started critiquing the game, and the title alone had so many things wrong with it, which gives you a good idea of what's to come. The game begins with a well-crafted opening cutscene. The credits sequence features black and white wartime imagery, character introductions and battlefield locales, all accompanied by the game's main theme. As it ends, the title appears, followed by a pre-rendered clip of American ships approaching Omaha Beach. We hear Daniels, the protagonist and player character, reading a letter to his brother Paul, establishing his journal entries as narration. We then transition in-game, seeing through Daniels' eyes inside the troop transport. This unskippable scripted sequence serves as a character introduction for Zussman, Aiello, Styles and Pearson. Their playful banter helps establish squad dynamics, but the introduction feels unnatural. Rather than letting the player meet these characters organically, we get a rapid-fire narration where Daniels outright describes each of them. While it's not a terrible introduction, it just feels underwhelming given the gravity the story wants us to give to these characters. The squad rushes off to the briefing and we meet Sergeant Pearson on the way. He is immediately established as the squad's uncompromising hardass, and that's putting it lightly. At this point, Zussman delivers one of the game's first questionable dialogue moments.
First Normandy, then the Rhine. We got this, Daniels.
This line makes little sense coming from a frontline soldier. There is no reason for him to assume the war's progression so simplistically, especially considering that the actual goal was to liberate France and push into Germany. The reason this line exists is obvious. The game begins with Normandy and it ends with Rhine, so it awkwardly forces this foreshadowing. It's a small detail, but one that feels contrived and immersion-breaking. The next pre-rendered cutscene features Colonel Davis' speech, inspiring the soldiers before they board their landing crafts. As they get on the boats, Daniel starts explaining the power dynamics between Pearson and Turner, framing Turner as the benevolent leader in contrast to Pearson's harsher methods. He also reflects on his older brother Paul, idolizing him and expressing his admiration to his character. We then return in-game as Daniels in the landing boat, writing these thoughts on a journal. What follows is a well-executed cinematic landing sequence. The approach to the shore is intense, under heavy machine gun fire, casualties are immediate, and shortly after, the player is finally given control. But stop, let's rewind a bit. From the moment the level begins to the point where the player actually gains control, nearly 9 whole minutes have passed. Even if the pre-rendered cutscenes are skipped, the game forces 5 minutes of unskippable in-game sequences. This destroys replayability, and what makes it worse is one of the level's achievements requiring players to reach the seawall without getting shot. If a player fails and messes up the checkpoint, they must repeat the level and endure all the unskippable content again. It's an unnecessary and frustrating design choice. That's not to say that the beach landing itself is bad. On the contrary, it's one of the game's strongest moments. However, the game soon undermines itself again. After reaching the seawall and engaging in some solid trench firefights, the player enters a bunker, triggering a scripted sequence. Here, a German soldier appears, who seems to be holding a Kar 98K with extended magazine, a weapon configuration that shouldn't even exist in this game. This blatant inaccuracy is impossible to ignore, especially in a game that tries to present itself as a gritty and grounded World War II experience. It's baffling that neither the developers nor the quality assurance team noticed or cared. Unreasonable gun besides, the scripted sequence goes on with multiple quick-time events that basically slow down time until you hit or miss the prompt, which are getting in the way of the cutscene and don't really provide anything meaningful or fun. They want to give the illusion of participating in the cutscene, but it just feels strict and forced. Eventually, Zussman gets stabbed, and after killing the enemy, we run to help him. Zussman calls out an incoming enemy, our camera turns towards the enemy, a pistol is drawn out, and we have to shoot him. After we do so, the scripted sequence continues. This pistol draw quick time happens several times throughout the game. These pistol sequences are the most awkwardly paced quick time events in the game. You are locked in place, given a pistol with seemingly infinite ammo, and expected to shoot at very obviously scripted enemies. It's not cinematic, it's not enforcing the gameplay, it's not fun, it's just awkward and off, and it happens many times later through this specific sequence. Afterwards, we have to carry Zussman by moving around in a predetermined path that the player view follows as we press any of the movement keys, and at times we stop, pull out our pistol, and shoot at some obviously pre-placed enemies. This just reeks of low quality and effort, and there's nothing positive or fun about this sequence. There's also a forced grenade throwback, which is very funny because it's so random and out of place. After this horrible scripted sequence finally ends, we leave Zussman with the medic, regroup with the rest of the squad, and proceed to the final objective of the mission, which is to take out an artillery gun and defend against an enemy counterattack. If we exclude the unskippable character introduction cutscene and the terrible Get Zussman to safety sequence, the level is pretty good. The next level, Operation Cobra, begins with a loading cinematic that provides a brief mission debrief while showing Zussman rejoining the squad after partially recovering from his stab wound. Once in-game, we start on a tank ride through an open field. Right away, we see Pearson questioning whether Zussman is ready to fight, reinforcing him as the squad's hard-ass. As the tank convoy rolls out, we are introduced to Perez, a tank operator who offers insight into Pearson's backstory, specifically referencing the Battle of Kasserine Pass in North Africa. According to Perez, Pearson's recklessness got his men massacred, leading it to his demotion. However, this is not exactly how things went, as this is merely hearsay. Through the game we get several Kasserine Pass references, but we don't get a clear answer of what exactly happened only until the very end. After some light-hearted squad banter, the convoy gets attacked by Stuka dive bombers. We dismount, regroup and push forward, fighting through a barn, a forest area and open fields before reaching an enemy anti-air gun. At this point, the player is tasked with shooting down enemy aircraft using the AA gun. Unfortunately, this sequence feels far less polished than it should be. The aiming mechanics feel inconsistent, making it frustrating to properly lead shots on moving planes. There's a clear attempt to mimic turret sections from previous Call of Duty titles, but it just feels off. The lack of responsiveness makes it feel unsatisfying and more of a chore than a fun turret section. Moving on, we encounter enemy anti-tank emplacements in a trench line. The battle itself is solid, we take over them, we push through the fields, and we reach the end of the objective. Nothing negative here besides having encountered a script softlock in the past, in the middle of this battle sequence, where the game just wouldn't proceed in the part in between the two barns. After clearing the area, the mission requires us to drive a jeep. This is one of a handful of jeep driving segments through the campaign, and to put it bluntly, they are just not fun. The paths are restricted, linear, and while there are a few alternate routes, they serve no real purpose. The driving itself feels wrong, unresponsive, and completely devoid of any sense of excitement. What makes it worse is that Zussman eventually takes the wheel and the player mans the mounted MG, which is significantly more enjoyable than driving. Frankly, the game would have been better off skipping the driving entirely and turning these segments into straightforward turret sequences. Once the jeep sequence ends, the level ends as well. During the loading cinematic of Stronghold, we get some surprisingly well-written dialogue between Daniels and Zussman. Daniels wakes up from a nightmare that has seemingly been hunting him for a while, and the only hint we get about the dream is that his brother Paul is yelling, "Red, take shot!" with Red being Daniels' nickname. This immediately establishes that Daniels suffers from PTSD tied to a past event involving his brother. Zussman asks Daniels about the dream, and Daniels explains that Paul was once attacked by a wolf, but Daniels didn't load his rifle in time to shoot. Paul ended up killing the wolf himself and surviving, but the experience scarred Daniels, making him swear to never fail his brother or anyone like that ever again. This is a fantastic foundation for character motivation and development. The idea that Daniels' past trauma fuels his current actions has immense storytelling potentials that weren't fully utilized. Once the level starts, our objective is to reach the church bell tower. We immediately engage enemies in an open firefight, which is a welcome change. Many levels in this game drag their introductions out, but in this one we jump straight into combat. However, this is where some of the game's biggest visual issues become noticeable. While the playable areas are well detailed, anything outside those areas is either covered in excessive fog, low-resolution textures, or outright disappears at certain distances. This isn't just a minor nitpick, it's an observable inconsistency that makes the game feel rushed and unpolished. This issue extends throughout the campaign, where out-of-bounds areas often feel lazily handled despite the game's otherwise strong visuals. The first part of the level is quite decent. We take over the street, the church, and climb up the bell tower where a sniper cover segment begins. This is a classic Call of Duty style objective where the player covers their squad from above using a sniper rifle. Mechanically, it's fine, but given the campaign's length, it takes too much time away from open combat. Another odd detail here is that German snipers wear ghillie suits. While it's certainly possible that SOE snipers used camouflage, the modern style ghillie suits seen here look highly anachronistic. Not only that, but these snipers are positioned inside urban buildings, a completely illogical and impractical place to wear such camouflage. It of course is a small detail again, but it further contributes to the game's lack of historical authenticity. Once the sniper sequence ends, the bell tower is hit by enemy fire, triggering an overtly long, excessive, scripted destruction sequence. This is where the level completely falls apart. Literally. The bell tower collapse is dragged out through multiple intrusive quick-time events, making the entire sequence feel tedious rather than intense. First, the game forces you to partially climb down a ladder, only to interrupt with a scripted collapse. Then, you climb down a staircase, only to be interrupted again by another scripted fall. Finally, after briefly regaining control, you are once again thrown into a scripted moment where Pearson pulls you out to safety just in time to witness the full destruction of the church tower. Sequences like this are not fun. I understand the intent, as Call of Duty is known for its bombastic set pieces, but there's a difference between an engaging cinematic moment and a frustratingly long and intrusive scripted sequence. In Advanced Warfare, the Golden Gate Bridge collapse worked well because it was properly paced and tied into the story naturally. Here, the bell tower collapse feels random, excessive, and completely unnecessary. If the time and effort spent on this sequence had been used to create a more substantial level with a larger combat zone, the experience would have felt far more in line with what a World War II game should offer.
You see wings on me, Private?
No, Sergeant.
That's because I'm not your fairy godmother!
Daddy, chill.
After surviving the bell tower destruction, we must defend against an enemy counterattack before reuniting with Zussman, and then the level ends. This was a terribly underutilized level. The pacing, the structure, and the design all had a lot of problems, and they all felt off. It starts with the church exterior gunfight, then the church takeover, then the bell tower sniper cover sequence, and finally the churchyard defense. That feels like a very small and confined area of a town to act as a whole level in a game with only 11 levels. It just doesn't feel like something planned properly on paper. The next level begins with a short debrief cutscene that does little to advance the main story. The only noteworthy detail is the rather odd justification as for why a US Army platoon is teaming up with the S.O.E. Apparently it's because they performed well in the previous mission. It's a weak setup and it feels forced, as if the writers needed an excuse to include the player's squad in a covert sabotage operation. The mission's objective is to stop a heavily armored German train, but the logistics of this plan make no sense. The enemy forces outnumber and outgun the Allied forces, and the train is heavily defended. Given that, I have no idea what the original plan to take over the train was in the first place. The game never really explains this, making the entire premise feel hollow and poorly thought out. The level also introduces the game's stealth system, which leaves a lot to be desired. Initially, the game guides the player through a set of predetermined stealth takedowns alongside friendly NPCs. A few kills later, the player is allowed to navigate a garden area in his own way, suggesting a level of stealth freedom and openness. However, trying to play this segment stealthily feels pointless, frustrating, and not rewarding at all. In a well-designed stealth game, successfully remaining undetected should feel rewarding. Completing an area silently should offer benefits, such as reducing enemy resistance in the next encounter or a sense of strategic accomplishment. However, in this level, stealth is meaningless. Even if you play the section flawlessly, the game forces you into open combat anyway, because the train starts leaving, triggering an alarm. This completely invalidates the entire stealth sequence. The stealth mechanics themselves are horribly unpolished, you cannot mark enemies, you cannot lure them, and the enemy patrol routes are static and unengaging, making stealth feel like a rushed afterthought rather than a core mechanic. It compares in no way with the extremely fun and rewarding stealth system of the Far Cry series, where it seems to be drawing ideas from, just not the right ideas. Even Advanced Warfare, which had a similar approach to stealth, executed it far better, probably because it was made with more passion and effort. Once we reach the end of the stealth segment, enemy reinforcements arrive, leading to a short firefight before the squad moves towards the train. This is followed by yet another jeep driving sequence, and somehow this one is even worse than the first one. The road visibility is poor, making it difficult to see obstacles, and the jeep's controls feel unresponsive. Once again, the sequence transitions from driving to mounting the MG turret, where the player is expected to gun down enemies and fire at the train. I am no train takeover expert, discovered, but I seriously doubt that one jeep with 2 soldiers and 1 MG turret can stop a train full of heavy guns and dozens of enemy soldiers. Again, what was the plan here? Stop the train, but how? Getting on the train and fighting across the train cars sounds like a much better idea for a train level than chasing it with a jeep. And as if that wasn't absurd enough, the sequence proceeds in one of the most ridiculously over-the-top scripted distraction scenes I have ever seen in a video game. The jeep somehow gets ahead and under the train engine, Daniels and Zussman jump out, and what follows is an absolute mess of nonsensical distraction. The train derails in the most exaggerated fashion possible, watchtowers are destroyed, debris falling in every possible direction, train cars spiral into the air. It's not just over the top, it's just insultingly stupid at this point. This complaint isn't about pacing or believability or World War II accuracy or whatever. It's about just why. Why was so much development time put into this ridiculous scripted sequence instead of improving more important aspects of the game? Why not refine the stealth mechanics instead? Why not create a longer, more open and engaging firefight? Why not design an actual train infiltration mission where the player fights through the train cars instead of chasing it down with a jeep? That would have been a far better train level, both mechanically and thematically. It just drags on and on, feeling like a Michael Bay action movie rather than a World War II game. While Call of Duty has always embraced cinematic spectacles such as this, there's a fine line between exciting set pieces and outright absurdity, and this train derailment crosses that line 10 times over. Once the dust finally settles, we are introduced to Rousseau, a French resistance fighter, who helps us proceed through the train wreckage to regroup with our platoon. By the way, do you remember in the last level where I talked about disappearing buildings in the background? Is this even a background building? Following the events of S.O.E, the game takes a detour from the main campaign even further. The opening cutscene for Liberation expands on Rousseau's backstory, explaining that she lost her family to a German officer named Heinrich, who also happens to be the head of the German garrison in Paris. This sets up her personal vendetta against him and establishes a clear revenge arc. Meanwhile, Crowley briefly mentions fighting alongside Pearson and Kasserine, describing him as brave, something I have more to say about later. For the first half of the level, we play as Rousseau, disguised as a German secretary, infiltrating the garrison to perform a briefcase exchange with an inside contact. This infiltration segment is surprisingly well executed. The game requires players to remember key details on their passport when passing through checkpoints, creating small but effective tension moments. The ability to freely explore the building and gather intel makes this segment feel immersive and fun to go through. It's reminiscent of the classic Medal of Honor levels, which popularized the disguised as a Nazi trope. However, some of the visual choices made by the developers don't make much sense given the historical and ideological context of the setting. By looking at the screen you can clearly tell what I'm talking about. Whether this was an artistic decision or something else, it's hard to understand why they made this choice. It doesn't appear to be a shading issue, and it feels deliberate. Once we locate the inside man, Rousseau is instructed to find a way into Heinrich's office to access the war room for the briefcase exchange. However, before she can complete the task, Heinrich himself shows up, initiating a tense dialogue exchange with Rousseau in his office. This ultimately leads to a fight, ending with Rousseau killing Heinrich as revenge for her family. While this moment works in isolation as a basic revenge subplot, it feels like a major detour from the main story. Rousseau's personal vendetta adds nothing meaningful to the larger narrative. This is a self-contained side story that, while functional, feels disconnected from the rest of the campaign. The next section brings back the game's stealth mechanics, and as expected, all the flaws from S.O.E apply here as well. To its credit, however, this stealth sequence specifically is slightly more polished, it's more open-ended, and it offers a bit more player freedom. However, the stealth system itself is still painfully lacking, enemy AI is basic, you can't mark or distract enemies, and overall it feels unrefined. While not as frustrating as the previous level's attempt at stealth, it's still not engaging enough. After planting the explosives, we switch back to Daniels, who is stationed across the river with the rest of his platoon, as well as the French resistance, and when the explosives detonate, the assault on the garrison begins. From here, the level returns to standard gunfights, which are decent but nothing remarkable. It's classic Call of Duty combat, and while it's enjoyable, there's nothing particularly noteworthy about this sequence. Upon reaching the garrison, Crowley and Rousseau regroup with Daniels, leading into a scripted breach sequence. Before breaching, Crowley hands Daniels a shotgun, forcefully replacing whatever weapon the player was carrying at the time. Intrusive inventory changes such as these are never welcome. If the game wants the player to use a shotgun, at least have the courtesy to drop their weapon on the ground so they can retrieve it afterwards if they wish to keep it. After clearing the lobby, we proceed upstairs with Zussman to provide sniper cover. At this point, the game encourages the use of Molotovs, which uses a HUD reticle from Advanced Warfare. That's because World War II was developed on Advanced Warfare Engine 4. While minor in the grand scheme of things, it broke immersion for me instantly, making it obvious that not enough care was put into cleaning up the basic UI elements. Eventually, our sniping position catches fire, forcing us to jump down. Sounds like every time there's a sniper sequence, something has to collapse or explode, forcing player to abandon their position. It's not necessarily a bad thing, just something that repeats enough times across the games to become noticeable. Daniels is injured from the fall and must crawl to retrieve a Panzerschreck to take out an enemy half-track, marking the final gameplay moment of the mission. With the battle won, the squad regroups Crowley, Rousseau, Zussman, Pearson, Turner and the rest, and they discuss their victory. However, the moment is interrupted by fireworks, which briefly startle everyone, because they mistake them for enemy fire. Then comes one of the dumbest line of dialogue in the game. Vivian casually walks by and says,
"City of Lights."
What? What the f?
Yes, Paris is called the City of Lights, but there's no reason to state it here. That dialogue line itself feels so out of place and was so unnecessary and unnatural that makes me feel as if the game actively insults my intelligence. The fireworks have already made it obvious what's happening. Yes, fireworks obviously emit light, but that's not why Paris is called the City of Lights. Saying it like that makes her look like a fool. After that line, she says,
Finally, something to celebrate, eh, Crowley?
why not directly say this instead? Anyway, with that, the level ends, with everyone celebrating except Pearson, of course. At this point, I was really hoping for the game to end, but unfortunately it didn't. Collateral Damage is easily one of the worst levels in the game. I cannot overstate how much this level frustrated me. The loading cinematic briefing establishes two things. Daniels has received a letter from his wife that he is hesitant to read, fearing that it may be about their divorce, and the platoon will soon attack Aachen State Theater next morning. That's about it. The level's short opening sequence is very cinematic, featuring quick cuts of the squad running under fire, intercutting with black screen before transitioning to the real-time sequence. While it's a well-executed visual technique, it feels misplaced as it isn't the kind of moment that needed an artistic touch like this. It's not game-breaking, just unnecessary and artistically inconsistent with the rest of the game. Once we gain control, we rush to the field phone to call in for support, which then transitions us into the perspective of Perez's tank crew. This brings us to the absolute worst tank sequence I have ever played in any video game ever. Everything about this tank section is atrocious. The controls, the pacing, the fun factor, all of them are just terrible. The tank aiming sensitivity on PC is entirely broken. I tested multiple settings, but nothing seemed to work. I had to physically move my mouse across the desk multiple times to turn the turret and aim properly. And it's not just a PC issue. Console players have also reported the same problem on their end. This isn't just a bad PC port, this is a fundamentally broken tank driving mechanic. The movement controls are also abysmal. Depending on your momentum and movement direction, your turning inputs might just suddenly invert, making controls unpredictable and even more frustrating. It's clear that the developers tried to create a system where the tank's movement logic adjusted dynamically, but instead of fixing confusion, it actively causes more of it. Later on, we get to actually fight against enemy tanks, which can't be destroyed with frontal hits. This is utter nonsense. While it's true that flanking shots are more effective in real-life tank combat, direct frontal hits can absolutely penetrate armor under the right circumstances. A much better approach would be the following: make some frontal shots ricochet, while letting others deal reduced damage, rather than forcing players to flank every single time. This tank sequence alone makes collateral damage the worst level of the game. It just doesn't matter what comes next at this point. Even if what follows is the coolest story or the best gameplay possible in the game, it's just not enough to compensate for the frustration that the tank sequence caused. After the painful tank sequence is finally over, we switch back to Daniels as we advance through destroyed buildings to reach our target. This section is quite straightforward, involving decent firefights in urban setting both outdoors and indoors. Eventually, we take over a hotel and move to secure the basement. There, we discover a group of civilians seeking refuge. The squad decides to evacuate them, and Daniels heads outside with Aiello to retrieve a German truck for transport. We bring the truck by and civilians start boarding it. However, a woman says that her sister is still downstairs, prompting Daniels to volunteer to retrieve her. As soon as we open the basement door, we enter a scripted hand-to-hand fight sequence with an enemy full of quick-time events. For some reason, the quick-time events in this sequence feel much harder to follow than usual. The timing feels off, the prompts end too quickly, and it's just not fun. After escaping, Daniels locks the basement door and enemies outside immediately start shooting through it. Here's the problem: we clearly see bullets tearing through the wood, yet Daniels, standing right behind the wood door, somehow doesn't get hit. It's one of those moments that completely break believability and make plot armor so obvious that just don't work and scream of low effort. Anyway, Daniels proceeds downstairs, finds the little girl and plays a little hide and seek with the enemy soldiers before escaping. This hide and seek sequence is also borrowing mechanics from the game's stealth system, only you can't fight back. The bright side is that you can actually figure out the optimal path that the designers wanted you to follow, having clear enemy paths and prompts. Which is an improvement. However, this sequence with the girl is completely unnecessary, and it wastes time once again that could have been used for something far better suited for a World War II game. We reunite the girl with her family, and before the civilians are evacuated, we get another forced pistol shooting gallery sequence before the level ends. Death Factory begins with Daniels finally opening his wife's letter, only to discover that the formal tone was because she's pregnant. After taking a moment to process the news, Daniels exits the tent and finds himself on the mission's debrief about taking the Hill 493. Right away, there's an odd historical inaccuracy. The real-life battle should have been based on Hill 400, not Hill 493. That's something Call of Duty 2 actually got right. How World War II, a game supposedly focused on historical authenticity, managed to get this wrong is just beyond me. After the debrief, the platoon moves out and we find ourselves in a foggy forest clearing with a wooden bridge and a drained river, where we set up defensive positions. This section is actually pretty decent, the defense sequence works well, the ability to use mines, rocket launchers or other methods to take out enemy tanks is a nice touch, and the combat feels intense. However, the game's visual design once again held it back. While I understand that this is supposed to be a foggy forest, the excessive blurriness, heavy fog, and obviously low detail background assets make it feel like it's unfinished rather than atmospheric. This has been a recurring issue throughout the game. Anything outside the immediate player area looks rushed and low quality. One of the most noticeable gameplay bugs in this level involves the Browning M1919 machine gun. For some reason, aiming down the sides while firing causes the weapon model to shift unnaturally, completely throwing off the animation. What makes this especially odd is that this didn't seem to be the issue at launch. It looks like it was caused by a later update. How does something like that even happen? Single-player weapon files shouldn't be affected from multiplayer updates, yet here we are. Last time I checked, shotguns were far from standard issue in the World War II German army, if not entirely non-existent. Having that many soldiers using shotguns that often across many levels of the game feels extremely out of place and ruins any believability. It's very apparent that this was done to introduce multiple enemy NPC weapon classes to add variety to enemies. but I'd rather have authentic enemies than a variety of enemies that will put me off the experience, or at least a middle point. Not to mention that in this level, enemies with shotguns use incendiary shells, which makes it even more absurd and out of place. Again, this isn't about historical accuracy, it's about authenticity and believability. After splitting up, Zussman goes with Pearson and Daniels joins Turner's team, as they move deeper into the forest, eventually stumbling upon an enemy outpost. And once again, we see a few German snipers wearing full ghillie suits, which kills the believability and authenticity even further for the same reasons I talked about in the third level. Even if a ghillie suit would make sense in this specific level, as there's tons of vegetation, such full-body uniforms are out of place in a game like this, not to mention the use of the carabine weapon instead of a scoped Kar 98K or a G43 scope. And the reminder that there's tons of SVT-40s and not even one single G43 rifle, as it would be appropriate for Germans to use in that time period and era. After clearing the outpost, enemy artillery starts hitting our team's position and everyone starts running uphill. Daniels gets separated and starts hallucinating his brother Paul talking to him. This leads into another stealth sequence in the thick fog. On paper, this could have been great. The dense fog and atmosphere are great for a cool stealth section, but once again the mechanics are underwhelming. The same issues from previous stealth sequence return, no marking system, no proper enemy distractions, and the lack of depth in enemy behavior. It feels like it's only there to emphasize that you're alone and outgunned against enemies. After the stealth sequence, we reunite with Turner and sneak through the forest until we reach an opening. There we find a tall bunker from which an enemy sniper starts shooting from. We take cover and crawl closer to the bunker until he has no line of sight, eventually getting in the bunker, clearing out enemies and climbing on the top to find and eliminate the sniper, who of course wears a ghillie suit as well as using a carabine rifle. Seriously, these guys feel like they're out of an entirely different game or something. They don't feel anything like a German sniper in World War II. Later, we progress through the forest and regroup with the rest of the team. We fight through a few barn houses and secure the area from a counterattack. Pearson, Zussman and Aiello are still on their own somewhere else, and Turner wants us to hold and secure the area until they arrive to our position. Daniels and Stiles are still worried that Pearson might have proceeded with the attack on the hill without Turner and his team, which amplifies the fear of Pearson doing something similar to what he did back in Kasserine Pass, where he got his men killed. But it's still unclear of what exactly happened there. Daniels asks Turner if the rumors about Pearson at Kasserine Pass are true. Turner gives a vague and unclear answer, simply telling Daniels to pray he's never in a position like that. As they talk, they're told that Pearson indeed proceeded with the assault without the rest of the team, and they all head up to find them. The level starts and we come across Aiello, who is mildly wounded. He informs us that Pearson took the remaining men to attack the guns on the hill alone. Turner, visibly frustrated, orders the team to move up the hill. After an intense uphill battle, we finally regroup with Pearson and Zussman. This sequence features a surprisingly solid gameplay mechanic that has us covering an engineer as he moves up to destroy an enemy MG bunker. The mechanics of this section work well. The player suppresses the bunker with gunfire, then signals the engineer to advance to the next piece of cover. This pattern repeats until he reaches the target and places the explosives. Once the bunker is destroyed, the team regroups inside, leading into a heated confrontation between Turner and Pearson. At this point, Pearson's character continues to feel inconsistent. While his hard-ass leadership style is established, his decision-making feels unnatural. It's clear that the game wants to build tension between Turner's compassionate leadership and Pearson's brutal character, but instead of making Pearson's actions feel justified or tragic or paying off at the end, they just don't make sense, which will be highlighted even more when we talk about the Kasserine Pass incident in detail later on. The confrontation ends unresolved and the team pushes forward to take out an artillery gun while continuing to fight out-of-place shotgun-wielding Nazis, which is getting ridiculous at this point. The next area takes us into a trench network where we fight to destroy the last two artillery guns. After destroying the second gun, a Tiger II tank arrives along with a wave of enemy reinforcements. The objective requires us to climb onto the back of the Tiger and use a thermite grenade to disable it. Mechanically, this section is fine. It's a straightforward scripted tank chase. Nothing particularly bad, but also nothing that stands out as great. After using thermite for the second time, Daniels gets stunned and the Sherman tank arrives. Stiles shouts that it's Perez, the tank operator we played as in the horrible tank section in a previous level. And then the Sherman gets shot. At least that makes sure that we won't have to drive this thing again. It's unclear to me whether Perez survived or not, and we never seem to be getting an answer about this. I can barely see some of the tank crew evacuating the tank, but whether Perez is one of them or not is never answered. Two German soldiers emerge from the disabled Tiger tank. Turner arrives just in time to shoot both of them. He leans in to help Daniels up and gets shot by the tank commander. Now, something about Turner's movement here feels awkward. There's a strange pause between the part where he extends his hand to help Daniels and when he gets shot, as if the animation or motion capture timing was slightly off. It feels like as if Turner's waiting to be shot. This could just be me though. After Turner was shot, he falls on Daniels, and the enemy tank commander who shot him slowly gets off the tank and slowly reloads his pistol so he can shoot Daniels while very awkwardly monologuing in German, probably calling names. Daniels, the player, through a quick-time event, has to shoot the German commander using Turner's revolver, even though it should be a Colt M1911. We kill the commander, our team arrives and covers us as we move Turner to the side, and as we do that, we get to shoot enemies with the out-of-place revolver we got from Turner. This pistol segment doesn't feel as awkward as the one in D-Day, but it's still not very fun. Then, gameplay gets cut from what seems to be the best cutscene and probably the best part of the game. This cutscene is basically about Turner dying, but man, the quality is through the roof. It's raining, there's mud all over the place, and the way the rain interacts with the ground and the character's fabric, metallic or skin surfaces is exceptional. The character performance is also great, and the cinematography as well as the whole composition of the render is amazing. In the end, Turner gets shot and falls dead on the ground as enemy soldiers run past him. The way that the mud organically gets shaped appropriately by Turner's body as well as the footsteps is just beautiful. Truly a highlight of the game. Later we see Daniels delivering Turner's sidearm to Pearson, who has been now promoted and put in charge of the platoon. Now Pearson, in his typical warm-hearted way, appoints Daniels as his second in command, expecting full loyalty and obedience. The next level is Battle of the Bulge, a level that sounds very promising given the scale and historical significance of the battle. The loading cinematic opens with the squad mourning Turner's death on Christmas. Pearson, now in command, shows up drunk and causes friction within the squad. Daniels tries to calm him down, and Pearson eventually leaves. As he leaves, he shows actual human emotions for the first time in the game. He is clearly sad about losing Turner. Once in-game, we find ourselves in a snowy foxhole with Sussman, Aiello and Styles. Everyone is clearly freezing, which emphasizes the brutal winter conditions of the Ardennes. Pearson arrives and orders Daniels to resupply another foxhole to the east. At this point, the game allows free exploration of the American encampments, and this is one of the level's strongest moments. The visual storytelling is solid, capturing the harsh reality of the soldiers dug into the frozen forest, preparing for the German attack. Upon reaching the objective foxhole and dropping off the ammo, we spot an enemy patrol across the ridge. Daniels pulls out a sniper rifle, which this time is a scoped Lee-Enfield, instead of the standard Springfield 03 that American snipers would actually use. At this point, it feels like whoever was in charge of the weapon choices actively went out of their way to make the game feel less authentic. From the excessive SVT-40s instead of G43s, shotguns on German soldiers, and out-of-place weapons all over the place. After dealing with the enemy patrol, we are ordered to report to the command tent. Once we get there, we find Aiello and we meet an African-American engineer named Howard. Aiello presents Howard as a surprise, which heavily indicates racial bigotry on Aiello's part. There is no debate about the historical reality of African-American soldiers fighting in World War II, nor the discrimination they faced, which is of course condemnable in every single way. However, historically, African-American soldiers fought in segregated divisions, making Howard's presence in this particular unit questionable and artificial. It gives the impression that the game wants to preach about sensitive real-life topics into a historically based game, which should have fun as its only purpose. The real issue here isn't historical accuracy, it's that this feels like modern political commentary on sensitive topics that people want to forget about when playing a game. Yes, racism existed at a far higher rate at the time, and yes, it's important to acknowledge that such practices are absolutely unacceptable. But when game developers put politics over fun stories, they betray the sole reason for which games are made. If I were a victim of racism and if I returned home after a difficult day to sit down and play a game, I would want to forget about these issues and not be reminded of them. If you absolutely have to address these sensitive issues, make a product that directly explores them instead. And it's a real shame because Howard is played by the same voice actor who played Cormac in Advanced Warfare, and he did a great job as both characters are very likable. After a short debrief, the Germans launch their attack and the entire ridge comes under heavy fire. We regroup with Zussman, Aiello and Howard and then cross an open field to locate a radio for calling in an airstrike. Once we reach the partially destroyed hut containing the radio, we successfully call for air support, which leads to one of the worst gameplay sequences in the campaign. The perspective shifts to a P-47 fighter, and we are now piloting an aircraft to protect friendly bombers. Just like the broken tank controls in Collateral Damage, the mouse sensitivity and responsiveness for the aircraft are also horrible. The aiming feels delayed, the movement feels unresponsive, and lining up shots is extremely frustrating. If you watch my full gameplay of this mission, you can clearly see my struggle, and again, no matter how much I adjusted my settings, nothing felt right. Again, this isn't just a PC port issue. Players on all platforms have reported that the vehicle controls are problematic. It's yet another example of how drivable vehicles in this game were horribly implemented on all sides. Even if the controls had worked properly, the dogfight mechanics are dull and uninspired. Compare this to the satisfying air combat of Battlefield 1 or Infinite Warfare's space dogfights. Once the miserable plane section finally ends, we return to the ground, back in control of Daniels, as we fall back to the ridge for a final stand. The defense sequence that follows is actually pretty fun, waves of enemies pushing forward that we have to fight against. We can also find another Browning M1919, which, as mentioned in the Death Factory, still has broken firing animations when aiming. As the battle continues, we regroup with Pearson, who calls in an airstrike directly on our position. This alarms everyone and the squad scrambles for cover, trying to escape the blast radius. Daniels runs alongside Zussman but gets stunned before reaching a foxhole. Once he gets in the foxhole with Zussman, Daniels requests a pistol, triggering another boring pistol sequence. This time, the pistol sequence ends with a direct and uninspiring Saving Private Ryan reference. An ominous tank slowly approaches, and when all we have is an empty pistol, an ally airstrike hits the tank and saves us. Not original, not fun, not adding anything to the story or experience, just predictable references to already better World War II media. After every important character recovers from the airstrike shock, they recollect themselves and Aiello says that he has seen that look on Pearson before, and it was right before the events of Kasserine Pass. More on that later. This was a good level, ruined by the inclusion of sensitive topics and a horrible airplane sequence. Ambush begins with the squad escorting German prisoners. One of them asks Zussman for water, and this small distraction gives the prisoner an opportunity to escape, leading to a chase where Daniels catches him. Upon searching him, Daniels finds critical enemy documents, revealing that the Germans plan to destroy the Remagen Bridge, which is the last bridge across the Rhine and the last chance of the US forces to cross into Germany. It also says that explosives for the bridge are loaded onto trucks 5 miles north. With this new intel, the platoon sets up an ambush for the enemy truck convoy. The ambush sequence itself is okay, but once it's over, the mission starts going downhill. The platoon confiscates the trucks, deciding to use them as a disguise to infiltrate a nearby airfield and destroy the explosives. Daniels is deployed with Zussman to infiltrate the base silently and find higher ground to cover the assault team. This infiltration is yet another stealth sequence. As I've mentioned multiple times, stealth in this game is unfun, unpolished and meaningless. While this level does deserve more credit for allowing multiple routes to the objective, the stealth mechanics themselves remain as weak as before. And I have to add, this level just doesn't feel like a level out of a World War II game. You can pick any modern or future setting, adapt this level to it, and you have a level. It gives me a strong impression that this might have been a level for Advanced Warfare 2, but it was repurposed for World War II. This is just an impression I got. Other than that, there's literally nothing profound I can talk about this level besides the ending. It's dull, plain, unfun, uninspiring, and just feels off like many other things in the game. Once the stealth section finally ends, we get into position to provide sniper cover fire for our allies as they assault the airfield. There is nothing new or exciting about this sequence. The game has already used this formula multiple times, and at this point it just feels lazy and uninspiring. Even the sniper mechanics themselves aren't satisfying. Using those sniper rifles in this game just doesn't feel very fun in the first place. At least we're giving a Springfield this time. After providing cover fire, we jump down and fight through the enemy camp towards a tall MG bunker. This short fight feels like the best part of the level because it involves regular Call of Duty gunplay. Once we reach the top of the MG bunker overlooking the airfield, another cover sequence begins, this time with an MG42 turret at our disposal. But that doesn't change the fact that this section is just another uninspiring cover sequence. After the bunker is hit by a Tiger tank, Daniels and Zussman fall near a German supply truck. As they recover, Zussman immediately acknowledges the presence of nearby Germans and says,
"This is bad. Jewish POWs don't get off easy."
This line is extremely awkward because it's literally forced exposition for the player. Daniels already knows this information, making it feel unnatural and redundant. Furthermore, the timing is bizarre because Zussman has barely recovered from the fall, and instead of focusing on the immediate danger, he takes the time to deliver an out-of-place warning. The Germans capture Zussman and load him into the truck, and before they can capture Daniels, Allied soldiers arrive and open fire, preventing Daniels from getting captured. Daniels, desperate to save Zussman, gets on the jeep that Pearson arrived in while directly disobeying his order to stand down and recklessly chases after the truck. Which takes us to the final jeep chase of the campaign, which is the worst of them all. There's nothing fun or engaging about this sequence, just another linear, poorly controlled vehicle section with clunky mechanics. This time it's even more frustrating because there's no MG turret section, meaning that the only way to take down enemy trucks is to ram into them. It feels unpolished and lifeless, especially when other games like Far Cry 4 allow you to drive and shoot with one-handed guns, which made for some amazing open-world drive and shoot mechanics. This game came out 3 years later, and the best it could do is having you to drive on very poorly designed and limited paths, while having terribly unresponsive controls. We crash into the enemy truck, but other trucks get in the way, causing a huge crash of multiple vehicles. At least this time we don't have train cars flying everywhere. Clearly injured from the crash, Daniel scrolls towards a weapon to reach it before a German soldier does. We perform yet another quick time event to kill him, then stand up and attempt to shoot at the truck. Eventually Daniels gets shot and collapses as Zussman is taken away. Later, Daniels wakes up, Pearson shows up and accuses Daniels of desertion and gets ready to pull out his pistol and shoot at Daniels. That move alone from Pearson is utterly absurd and contradictory. More on that later. Before Pearson can do anything, the rest of the team arrives and Pearson says that this isn't over and that Daniels doesn't belong in his platoon anymore. Daniels gets rescued and we fade to black, thus ending the level. Then we get a pre-rendered cutscene showing Germans assembling American POWs with Zussman being among them. The Germans are looking for Jewish prisoners, but they load all of them in the train heading to a labor camp anyway. Decent cutscene, not too much to add. We then fade into an in-game cutscene of Daniels recovering in a medical tent. Colonel Davis arrives and Daniels immediately criticizes Pearson, blaming him for letting Zussman get captured just like he left his men in Kasserine. Davis finally provides some insight into Pearson's past, revealing that Pearson's actual orders at Kasserine were to retreat, but instead he chose to go back and save his men, only to lose even more of them, while directly disobeying orders. Davis explains that this is why Pearson has never been the same since. While this sheds light on Pearson's backstory, it doesn't seem to excuse Pearson's demeanor throughout the game in any way. We'll discuss the full implications of this Kasserine incident later and analyze this inconsistency. Davis then informs Daniels that his discovery of the enemy document about the Remagen Bridge made him a hero, and that he will be returning home as one. As Davis leaves, Daniels looks at Zussman's pendant that he recovered as Zussman was being captured, reflecting on their promise to each other to make it to the end. Then we transition into another pre-rendered cutscene showing Daniels returning home to his brother Paul and his pregnant wife. Time goes on, his child is eventually born, and Daniels goes hunting with Paul. As they hunt, Paul praises Daniels for his bravery during the war. However, Daniels doesn't seem to feel like he deserves the hero status he's been given. We then fade back in-game, where Daniels again looks at Zussman's pendant, which shows that the previous cutscene was him imagining what life would be had he left without trying to save Zussman. This highlights that he would feel guilty if he gave up, as he already feels guilty for letting up his actual brother in the past during the wolf incident. Furthermore, he had promised his brother, Paul, that he'll be the best he can be, and giving up without trying to save Zussman would be letting that promise down. Before the level Rhine, and as we load into a cutscene, we hear Daniels writing to his wife explaining that he needs to convince Pearson to let him back in the fight so he can find Zussman. During the in-game cutscene, we see Daniels confronting Pearson, ripping his honorable discharge paper to prove that he is more than willing to make sacrifices. Daniels also directly calls out Pearson about Kasserine Pass and insists that finding Zussman is essential. Pearson finally acknowledges what happened, and we get another missed opportunity. This would have been the perfect moment for a full flashback level, allowing us to experience Kasserine firsthand as Crowley, Aiello or Perez, and witness the full extent of Pearson's decision making, letting us understand his whole mindset. But alas, we can't have proper motivations and characters. As usual, we're left with nothing but exposition, wasted potentials and wishful thinking. With the confrontation over, Daniels is reinstated into the squad and the team heads out to capture the last bridge over the Rhine. Then we load into the actual level and we're thrown directly into the fight, which is always a welcome change of pace. If we exclude the unskippable confrontation cutscene we just witnessed. Note that if we want to load into this level, we first load into the Pearson confrontation cutscene, wait for it to end and then load into the Rhine level. This is a similar complaint with the one in D-Day, as they both feature unskippable in-game exposition cutscenes that keep you from starting the actual level. Instead of having these cutscenes as separate segments in the level select menu, those are loaded when the actual level is selected. Very poor development choices. The level itself is decent, but relatively short and small in scale. The entire battle takes place on the bridge and the river banks on either side, nothing more. It's hard not to compare this to earlier Call of Duty games, which featured massive and extensive battles across entire cities, lengthy vehicle sequences, and varied mission structures. In contrast, this level feels constrained and limited. The level progression is simple. We fight from one end of the bridge to the other, then take control of an enemy anti-air gun and shoot down enemy planes. Just like the anti-air sequence in Operation Cobra, this one just doesn't feel fun as well. The mechanics are clunky, the feedback from hitting the planes isn't as satisfying as it should be, and overall it's just not as enjoyable as other similar sections in past Call of Duty titles. After clearing the tunnel at the enemy side of the bridge, we take down the last wave of enemy resistance. The remaining German forces surrender, and just like that, the final battle is over. There's nothing inherently wrong with this sequence, but the fact that this is the game's gameplay finale makes it shockingly underwhelming. The battle itself is solid, but it doesn't feel like a grand climactic ending. Compared to the scale and intensity of past Call of Duty finales, this just falls flat. Of course, historically, the US forces didn't have a Reichstag moment like the Soviets. That is, of course, if we exclude the nukes in Japan. I can see the effort trying to make this last push feel like the big heroic ending of the campaign, but it doesn't land as powerfully as it should. Afterwards, we get an epilogue level where we look for Zussman at the end of the war. We begin with a squad arriving at a deserted concentration camp, searching for Zussman while the game depicts the atrocities that were committed there. After scouring the camp, we find trails that lead into the forest, suggesting that prisoners, including Zussman, were taken there. At this point, the game fades into a pre-rendered cutscene, but this one feels strangely out of place. This pre-rendered sequence is in first-person perspective, showing Daniel sprinting through the forest with an M1 Garand yelling for Zussman. This completely breaks the consistency of the game's cinematics. Every other pre-rendered cutscene in the game has been entirely cinematic with no first-person perspectives. This sudden shift to a first-person sprinting sequence, along with the player's weapon in view, feels comically out of place. The cutscene then fully transitions into Daniel's memory of Paul fighting with a wolf, replaying the same flashback scene earlier. This time, however, we get to see what really happened, as the game has been misleading us all along. After killing the wolf, Paul tries to walk away and eventually collapses and dies, revealing the real version of the events. We then fade back in-game looking for Zussman in the forest while holding an M1 Garand just like the pre-rendered cutscene. We take control of Daniels and start following the distant sounds of voices and gunfire, eventually reaching a narrow path leading into an open area. There we see a German officer pushing Zussman onto the ground and preparing to execute him. In a final gameplay moment we shoot the officer and save Zussman just in time. The final cutscene plays where we recover Zussman and then we fade to a shipyard where the squad is preparing to return home, saying their goodbyes on good terms. Even Pearson, oddly enough, seems at peace. Afterwards, we see Daniels visiting Zussman in the hospital, where he tells him that he came back because he could never leave him behind. Later, Daniels actually returns home for real this time, and he places his bronze star on Paul's grave. He speaks to Paul and explains how his dream has changed, realizing that Paul's sacrifice taught him what it truly means to be a hero, which is to risk everything for a brother. Quite emotional and decent ending, but far from flawless. The story of Call of Duty World War II isn't inherently bad. It has solid foundations for strong character writing and meaningful themes. However, does this feel like a story that fits a game titled simply World War II? Absolutely not. It covers an extremely short span of the war, focusing on one small American squad rather than presenting a broader depiction of the conflict. A title like Call of Duty Brotherhood sounds like a much more fitting example, as this is a personal story rather than a generalized World War II campaign. The plot has two focus points: Daniels' trauma in relation to his friendship with Zussman, and Pearson's overall demeanor towards the squad. The game begins with Daniels narrating his thoughts to his brother Paul, but as we learn later, Paul is dead. Daniels is writing all of this in a journal, using it as a personal way to process his thoughts and emotions. As an exposition tool, this works well, giving us insight into Daniels' perspective, but the way it's presented is misleading to the viewer. Daniels knows Paul is dead, yet the gameplay deliberately obscures this information, making it seem like Paul is still alive. You could argue that Daniels is praying to his brother's memory, using the journal as a way to cope with his trauma. However, this explanation falls apart, because during the cutscene where Daniels imagines himself returning home without having saved Zussman, Paul is shown to be alive. This makes the twist that Paul is actually dead to feel like a forced and artificial deception of the player. Daniels is fully aware that Paul is dead, and wouldn't imagine himself returning home with him alive. Even if it can be excused as daydreaming, it feels very obviously designed to mislead the viewer only to serve the twist's purpose. When Daniels was younger, Paul died during a wolf attack, and Daniels could have saved him had he been faster. Daniels is traumatized by Paul's death because he feels responsible and guilty for it. Ever since, Daniels made a promise that he would be the best he can be from that point on. That promise to his dead brother Paul, in conjunction with his promise to his best friend Zussman to make it to the end, defines Daniels' motivations and emotional background. That emphasizes the friendship between Daniels and Zussman as one of the story's better developed aspects. Throughout the campaign, they both look after each other, reinforcing their deep bond. After Zussman was captured, Daniels was given the opportunity to return home, but his guilt and promise to Paul and Zussman drove him to stay and look for Zussman instead, showing self-sacrifice and character integrity to keep his promise. Eventually he saves Zussman, fulfilling his promise to both Paul and Zussman, which completes his character arc and helps him recover from his trauma, signifying the end of his journey. This aspect of the story works well conceptually, but like many things in the game, it suffers from weak execution, poor pacing, problematic narrative, and uninspiring gameplay mechanics. Another important narrative aspect of the game is Pearson's attitude and the mystery surrounding Kasserine Pass. Pearson is presented through the game as a hard-ass who is always in bad temper, constantly giving his squad a hard time, while recklessly risking everything for no apparent reason. The story tries to excuse his behavior by hinting at an event that happened at Kasserine Pass, where Pearson's team was slaughtered, and it was supposedly his fault for prioritizing orders over the safety of his men, making him dreaded by his soldiers. Throughout the game, the exact details of the event remain unclear until the very end, where we learn that Pearson actually disobeyed orders in an attempt to save some of his men, but this decision led him to lose all of them instead. That means Pearson actually cared for his men back then and neglected his orders to save them. A flashback level at Kasserine Pass would have been the perfect way to resolve this mystery. Imagine playing as Crowley, Aiello, Perez, or even Pearson himself, experience the battle firsthand, and discover the truth about Pearson through gameplay rather than a long cutscene full of exposition. The way the game teased the Kasserine Pass incident so many times makes the lack of a flashback level a colossal missed opportunity. The excitement factor that such a level would provide would be through the roof, dare I say similar to the one in Black Ops 1 Project Nova level. This is a major wasted opportunity, made even worse by the fact that the developers had no issue creating diverse World War II assets for multiplayer. The excuse that a North Africa level wouldn't fit the campaign is invalid, especially given how the campaign already lacks variety in its missions. Now, the idea that this event changed Pearson into someone who would neglect his soldiers to blindly follow orders makes very little sense. If anything, after losing his men, he should have been even more determined to protect his squad and not the other way around. If losing his men traumatized him, why does he keep recklessly putting them in danger? Does he care about his soldiers? Does he not? It's really hard to tell because nothing about his behavior is consistent. He is upset that he lost 2 men in the bell tower, but then he risks his men on the hill advance and in the Ardennes with the airstrike. The worst example of this is when Daniels disobeys Pearson's orders and rushes to save Zussman, and then Pearson nearly executes Daniels for desertion. This is insane! Pearson himself disobeyed orders at Kasserine to save his men. More than anyone else, he should have recognized and sympathized with Daniel's motivations for what he did. This is just bad writing at this point. Does he care about his men? Does he care about the mission? Does he care about himself? Does he care about anything? It's really hard to tell because all Pearson does is give everyone a hard time for no apparent reason. It feels like he exists only to create tension within the squad, forcing conflict to keep things engaging. But when this conflict has no foundation, it just feels artificial and lacks believability. There doesn't seem to be anything profound about his behavior and how it was affected by the events of Kasserine Pass. If that event scarred him and there's a real reason about the way he acts, the game does a terrible job explaining it. Maybe I'm just misinterpreting things. I can't even tell at this point. The story of Call of Duty World War II had the potential to be great, but it falls apart due to lack of depth, missed opportunities, poor narration, and confusing character arcs. The Paul being dead twist is mishandled and misleading. Pearson's character arc is an incoherent mess. The narrative methods are lacking in many aspects. The lack of a Kasserine Pass flashback level is unforgivable. And while Daniels' personal journey is solid, it's not enough to carry the entire game. At its core, Call of Duty World War II isn't a game about World War II, it's a personal story set within World War II. The game feels more like a mediocre war movie rather than a real World War II game experience. This is not a story or a game that deserves a generalized title of World War II. Like I mentioned in the introduction, a title like Brotherhood would be a much better option. The game's gameplay is decent. The gunfights, inheriting the core fundamentals of Call of Duty gunplay, are fun. Fighting enemy NPCs in the campaign is definitely well done and leaves you wanting more. There are several innovations implemented, most of which enhance the gameplay, while others however drag it down. A rather interesting mechanic the game offers is the return of the health bar instead of regenerating health that has been a staple since Call of Duty 2. What World War II does with the health system feels experimental, but I think it's pretty good for what it is. You can collect health kits from enemies, find them in the world, or request them from Zussman if you get enough points. Then use them to heal yourself whenever you're hurt. It's a decent mechanic that didn't bother me personally, and it's one of the more creative things the game introduced. Another interesting mechanic the game offers is that specific squad characters can offer different bonuses. Turner provides ammo, Pearson highlights enemies,
Let me know the position!
Aiello gives a mortar strike smoke grenade, Styles refills grenade and smoke, and so on. However, this mechanic is severely underutilized, as the heavy narrative-focused gameplay doesn't allow for more open and more extended gunfight sequences where all these mechanics could be fully explored. If such a system existed in a game with long, rich gunfights like Call of Duty 2, let's say, it would be much better utilized. In World War II, it just feels restricted by which characters are present in each mission. If, for example, Turner isn't in a level with you, you have no way to refill your ammo unless you find the refill crate, which thankfully exists to counter this issue. The game's worst gameplay sections are the vehicle segments. Whether it's driving a jeep, controlling a tank, or piloting a plane, the gameplay noticeably worsens. The controls, the design, and the fun factor of these sequences are all severely lacking. There are also several sequences that force you to draw a pistol mid-cutscene to shoot at predetermined enemies. These moments feel completely out of place. They appear randomly, feel unpolished, and add nothing to the experience while also killing the pacing. Another major pacing issue is how the game balances its narrative with gameplay. Some levels begin with annoyingly long, unskippable in-game cutscenes that prevent you from getting into the action right away. Others start with cutscenes that are loaded as entirely separate levels which also cannot be skipped. And those separately loaded cutscene levels aren't even an option in the levels menu. You watch them as you enter the level from which they come before. Infinite Warfare and Black Ops Cold War had such cutscenes as separate entries in the level select menu, which made it easier to skip any long cutscene content and jump right into the battle. Both Infinite Warfare and Cold War also provide with cutscene skipping mechanics. For example, if you watch a cutscene, you can just press the skip button and you can just skip the cutscene, as simple as that. Those cutscene skipping mechanics should be something very fundamental in a game filled with narratively focused sequences, and it's a big negative that the game didn't pay attention to this. Overall, the cutscene to gameplay balance definitely feels off at times and actively gets in the way of the experience. All those little things show us that the gameplay leaves a lot to be desired, which highlights just how much potential was wasted. If we take a look at the weapons of the game, we will notice that the Germans frequently use guns like the Russian SVT-40 and PPSH, along with other rare weapons from that time period from various other countries. There have been a lot of discussions about whether this is historically accurate or not. There are reports that the Germans confiscated Russian weapons from the Eastern Front and later used them in the Western Front, which is definitely plausible. Even if historical accuracy isn't the main focus of this review, it is important to mention the issue that nowhere in the campaign do you ever see a G43 rifle, a very well-known German weapon that should have made an appearance as it was widely used in the battles that the game depicts. And as if that wasn't enough, there are two significant parts of the game where you can clearly see an extended magazine on weapons that couldn't realistically hold an extended magazine at the time. Those being Kar 98K with the extended magazine we see on the scripted sequence where Zussman gets stabbed, and during the Stronghold level on the side objective to drag a wounded ally to safety, who always seems to be holding an M1 Garand with extended magazine. Funnily enough, if this guy dies, the extended magazine part of the M1 Garand model disappears, and if you pick up the gun, it's just a regular M1, which shows even further the lack of attention to obvious details. Those are the two most obvious examples of absurd attachments, and there are more, less obvious ones throughout the campaign. Whether it's a technical error or something they overlooked, it doesn't matter. They either make a game era accurate or they don't, and some of them are really hard to miss. Again, this isn't about historical accuracy or realism, it's about making something that feels believable and authentic in a way that small mistakes like these won't take you out of the experience. In our case, they definitely do. Furthermore, many of the weapons the game chooses to depict feel off. both because we are not used to seeing these particular guns in these battles in other World War II focused media, and because they seem poorly chosen for the game's setting and era. There are Polish and other rare weapons that show up in the campaign that simply don't make sense as standard issue German weapons. For example, instead of using a scoped Kar 98 or a scoped G43 for snipers, the game introduces a carabine rifle, as they call it, which feels completely out of place. Not to mention the presence of Leonfield in American forces during the Battle of the Bulge, which also doesn't make much sense. Beyond that, the game also suffers from some very awkward weapon stat imbalances. For example, a BAR shouldn't take more than one bullet to kill with a headshot. Also, several gun proportions feel off. I understand that in order for players to be able to see clearly through the weapon sights, compromises have to be made in terms of their scaling. However, older games manage to get those proportions much better without making it difficult to aim. For example, the M1 Garand iron sight is too big compared to anything we've seen before. The MP40 sights look extremely tiny, and the Kar 98K model used for some reason has the worst iron sights in the game. And there are many other smaller examples of this that slowly add up to the game feeling wrong. When a World War II enthusiast player sees an extended mag on an M1 Garand or a Kar 98K, proportionately off sights, unreasonable damage stats, lack of iconic weapons that definitely were used in the depicted battles such as the G43, and misaligned aim animations that probably broke during an update, that player doesn't feel like playing a game that wants to represent an era in an honest and immersive way. With each mistake, the player will care less and less to invest in it. That's why these details and mistakes are important, because the more of them you have, the less your players will care. And if this game doesn't want to appeal to World War II enthusiasts, who does it want to appeal to then? Now, if you've ever seen me talk about such games, you would definitely expect me to have mentioned something music related. The reason I haven't said anything so far is because music in this game feels so forgettable, underwhelming, indifferent, uninspiring, and just mediocre. So much so that I didn't even care to comment about it at this point. Now, I know most people like the main theme of the game, and frankly it's okay, but far from anything special, memorable or exciting. It's just okay. However, the whole game is accompanied by extremely generic sounding orchestral tunes, which are all reusing the same theme and tunes over and over, making it feel extremely mediocre. It sounds like AI generated music if you were to put a prompt of generic World War II action music. To prove my point, first try to think of any of the game's soundtrack other than the main theme. I am confident that most, if not all of you, can't remember of any specific track other than vague main theme remixes. Secondly, I'll let a few seconds of Call of Duty World War II music play, and then I'll play some real World War II game music from other games. You can clearly see that other, better music compositions use multiple themes and motives rather than the same motive playing over and over with different mixing. Have a theme for Pearson, for example, which increases intensity every time he does something extreme. Have a calmer, more serene theme for Turner, giving a sense of comfort. Have a heroic theme for Daniels, for which probably we can use the main theme, but that's besides the point. And have another theme for Zasman, and mix it with Daniel's theme every time they fight together, bringing excitement and character to your music, amplifying whatever emotions come with the game. This is just basic music direction 101 that this game refuses to follow. But I guess the budget wasn't high enough to put enough effort to music. Now, all things considered, is this game bad? Actually, not at all. The game has a lot of merits and many decent things to offer. But is it good then? Also no. The game's strengths are overshadowed by its flaws, making it a mediocre product. The game is irrationally focused on a tiny group of people and represents only one aspect of the whole war, all while having a very generalized title of World War II. Like I mentioned earlier, a title like Brotherhood would make far better sense, but I guess it wouldn't be as marketable. The story is full of wasted potentials, and it only manages to get a few things right. Most characters feel unpolished, with Daniels being the most polished one, and Pearson being the most unreasonable and nonsensical character of the game. Narratively, the game relies heavily on exposition. While this technique is often criticized, I can see it working well in the story at times, although it's not very well executed. The narrative often misleads the viewer into believing things that are untrue. Things that the characters know are untrue. This misleading narrative feels unnatural because it makes it obvious that it was made this way to set up a twist. The gameplay sits on the same level of mediocrity. While there are some great innovations that show that some effort was given, and the core gameplay itself can offer decent fun, it's definitely drawn down by uninspiring world design, really awkwardly paced sequences, unfinished mechanics such as the stealth one, and over-the-top sequences that add absolutely nothing, as well as the horrible vehicle sections. Having only 11 levels, some of which are very short and restricted, and depicting only one front of the war, it leaves a lot to be desired. All these little things give the impression that this game was made out of force, not out of passion and genuine creative expression. It's as if Sledgehammer Games wanted to make Advanced Warfare 2, since they proved that they were passionate about Advanced Warfare, because by going through that game one can clearly tell that they really loved what they were doing there. But whatever plans they had about it were ruined by Activision, forcing them to make a World War II game instead, because futuristic games became very hated at the time. The fans could also share some of the blame, though their frustration with the futuristic setting at the time is totally understandable. However, in my opinion, the real source of this disaster is Activision and their lack of proper planning on the franchise at the time. Not that anything has improved since, but them forcefully changing plans that drastically gives us results like mediocre and full of wasted potential games like Call of Duty World War II. That would be all for the review. If you watched this long, thank you very much for listening. If you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Not everything I said is rock solid, and it can definitely be debated. Now, before I end the video, I would like to promote my own personal projects. They are basically Call of Duty 4 fan-made single-player campaigns that I have been creating for years. And it would mean a lot to me if you check them out. You can also join my Discord server, where you can hang out with my community and discuss Call of Duty games, custom Call of Duty content and more. Links for my projects and my Discord server can be found in the description and in the pinned comment. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.